There comes a moment in the life of a healed empath where they finally see the truth they spent years avoiding. They realize that what they called being nice was often just fear wearing a kind mask. Fear of rejection, fear of conflict, fear of losing people, fear of being misunderstood. And once that realization hits deeply enough, everything begins to change. For most of their life, the empath believed their value came from how much they could give. They thought love meant endless patience, endless understanding, endless forgiveness. They became the person who stayed calm while everyone else exploded. The person who apologized first even when they were hurt. The person who kept giving people chances long after the disrespect became obvious. And because they were naturally compassionate, they convinced themselves this behavior was maturity. But healing forces the empath to ask a painful question. Why am I constantly abandoning myself just to keep others comfortable? That question changes everything, because the healed empath starts recognizing that many of their kind behaviors were actually self-betrayal in disguise. Every time they ignored their intuition to avoid hurting someone's feelings. Every time they tolerated emotional neglect because they feared being alone. Every time they stayed silent after being disrespected because they didn't want drama. Every time they over-explained their pain hoping someone would finally understand. It was not love, it was survival. And survival mode can look very gentle from the outside. The empath begins to understand that trauma trained them to become emotionally useful to everyone around them. They learned early that being easy, agreeable, forgiving, and emotionally available kept relationships stable. So they became the safe place for broken people. The therapist friend. The emotional caretaker. The person who absorbed everyone's chaos while quietly bleeding inside themselves. But eventually, the exhaustion catches up. The healed empath reaches a point where they can no longer ignore how drained they feel after constantly carrying relationships alone. They notice how some people only come close when they need healing, validation, comfort, attention, or reassurance. They notice that certain people loved their softness but never respected their boundaries. They notice how often they were expected to understand, and everyone else while nobody truly tried to understand them. And slowly, something inside them hardens not into cruelty, but into clarity. For the first time, the empath realizes kindness without boundaries becomes permission for mistreatment. They understand that constantly giving people access to them did not make them loving it, made them available for exploitation. And this is the stage where people start saying, "You've changed." Yes, they changed. Because now the empath pauses before saying yes. Now they notice manipulation instead of excusing it. Now they stop chasing people who pull away. Now they stop explaining their worth to emotionally unavailable individuals. Now they stop shrinking themselves to make toxic people feel comfortable. And the people who benefited from the old version of the empath often react badly to this transformation. Some will call the healed empath cold. Some will say they became distant, selfish, arrogant, or difficult. But what truly changed is simple. The empath stopped abandoning themselves. That is what unsettles people. The healed empath no longer confuses love with sacrifice. They no longer believe suffering is proof of loyalty. No longer think enduring disrespect makes them strong. They finally understand that protecting their peace is not cruelty. It is emotional maturity. And one of the hardest parts of healing is accepting that some relationships only survived because the empath had no boundaries. Once boundaries appear, unhealthy connections begin collapsing almost immediately. Suddenly, people accuse the empath of being different simply because they are no longer tolerating behavior that once destroyed them emotionally. But healing was never meant to make the empath more convenient for others. It was meant to reconnect them with themselves. So now, instead of constantly rescuing everyone else, they start listening to their own nervous system. They stop forcing conversations that drain them. They stop overextending for people who reciprocate nothing. They stop believing they must earn love through exhaustion. And perhaps the most powerful shift of all is this. The healed empath no longer needs everyone to understand their boundaries in order to keep them. That changes their entire energy. Because when an empath truly heals, they stop begging for the bare minimum. They stop proving their art to people committed to misunderstanding them. They stop performing kindness at the expense of their own well-being, not because they became less caring, but because they finally learned they deserve some of that care too. One of the biggest shifts that happens when an empath truly heals is that they stop giving unlimited emotional access to people who continuously drain them. And for many people around them, this change feels shocking, because the healed empath is no longer available on demand. They no longer rush to rescue every broken person. They no longer sacrifice their emotional stability just to keep someone else comfortable. Before healing, the empath often believed love meant endurance. They believed that if someone was cold, distant, avoidant, inconsistent, or emotionally wounded, then they simply needed more understanding. So the empath kept showing up. They kept listening, kept forgiving, kept explaining away toxic behavior with empathy. He's just scared. She's been hurt before. They don't mean it. They're struggling. The empath became an expert at understanding everyone except themselves. And because they could see the pain inside people, they ignored the damage those same people were causing them. They stayed emotionally available long after the relationship became unhealthy. They answered late-night messages from people who disappeared during the day. They gave reassurance to people who never offered stability in return. They poured emotional energy into connections that survived entirely on their effort. What the empath did not realize at the time was that constant access teaches people they never have to value your presence. When someone knows you will always stay, always forgive, always understand, and always return no matter how badly they behave, many people stop respecting your emotional limits altogether. That is why healing changes everything. Because the healed empath begins recognizing patterns instead of potential. They stop focusing on who someone could become and start paying attention to who they consistently are. They notice the manipulation hidden inside mixed signals. They recognize when someone only reaches out for validation, comfort, attention, or emotional regulation. They stop romanticizing emotional unavailability as depth. And perhaps for the first time in their life, the empath understands something painful. Not everyone deserves unlimited access to their heart. This realization is difficult because empaths naturally want to help. They naturally want to see the good in people. They naturally believe patience can heal relationships. But healing teaches them that compassion without discernment becomes self-destruction. So the healed empath begins doing things they once felt guilty for. They stop responding immediately to emotionally draining people. They stop chasing conversations after being ignored. They stop over-explaining their feelings to people committed to misunderstanding them. They stop trying to rescue people from consequences they created themselves. And suddenly, the dynamics around them begin changing. People who once relied on the empath's emotional availability start feeling the distance immediately. Some become confused. Some become angry. Some try harder to manipulate the empath through guilt, silence, inconsistency, or emotional games. Because toxic dynamics often collapse the moment the empath stops overfunctioning. The healed empath notices something important during this stage. Many people were attached to their emotional labor, not to them as a person. That truth hurts deeply, because the empath starts realizing how often they were valued for what they provided rather than who they were. Their patience, their listening, their forgiveness, their softness, their emotional support. But when the empath finally becomes tired, overwhelmed, or unavailable, some people disappear completely. And strangely enough, this heartbreak becomes part of the healing, because it forces the empath to stop confusing being needed with being loved. For years, they believed relationships survived because of deep connection. But healing reveals that many relationships survived only because the empath tolerated imbalance. Once they stop carrying the emotional weight alone, the connection begins falling apart naturally. And instead of desperately trying to save it like they once would have, the healed empath now allows certain relationships to end. That is growth. Not every relationship deserves another conversation. Not every misunderstanding deserves another explanation. Not every emotionally unavailable person deserves continued access to your peace. The healed empath finally understands that boundaries are not punishment. Distance is no. Cruelty. Silence is not hatred. Sometimes protecting your emotional energy is the healthiest thing you can do. And what makes this transformation so powerful is that the empath no longer acts from desperation. They no longer fear losing every connection. They no longer panic when someone pulls away. Instead, they observe. They pay attention. They let people reveal themselves through patterns instead of words. This makes them much harder to manipulate, because toxic people often survive on emotional access. They rely on the empath constantly explaining, fixing, chasing, reassuring, and emotionally engaging. But when the empath becomes calm, grounded, and emotionally disciplined, those old tactics stop working. The healed empath no longer needs closure from people incapable of accountability. They no longer beg for consistency. They no longer exhaust themselves trying to force mutual effort. And perhaps the most powerful part of all is this. The healed empath still has a beautiful heart. They still care deeply. They still love deeply. But now their compassion includes themselves too. So instead of giving everyone unlimited access to their mind, emotions, time, and energy, you become selective, intentional, aware. Not because they became cold, but because they finally learned that constantly pouring into people who drain you is not love, it is abandonment of the self. One of the most uncomfortable transformations people witness in a healed empath is the moment they stop needing to be liked by everyone. For most of their life, the empath carried a deep fear of disappointing others. They wanted harmony, peace, emotional connection. They wanted people to feel safe around them, understood by them, accepted by them. And because of that, they often ignored their own discomfort just to maintain relationships. They said yes when they wanted to say no. They stayed quiet when something hurt them. They tolerated disrespect to avoid conflict. They over-explained themselves, hoping to prevent misunderstandings. They carried emotional burdens that were never theirs to carry. And slowly, without realizing it, their identity became tied to being the nice one. The empath became known as the understanding person, the forgiving person, the patient one, the one who would always give another chance. But beneath that kindness was often a painful truth. They were terrified that setting boundaries would make people leave. So they kept abandoning themselves in small ways. Every time they ignored a red flag, every time they accepted inconsistent treatment, every time they let someone cross a line because they didn't want to seem difficult, every time they minimized their own pain to protect someone else's feelings. The empath convinced themselves that keeping the peace was maturity. But healing eventually reveals something devastating. Peace built on self-betrayal is not peace at all. It is emotional exhaustion disguised as love. And this is where the real transformation begins. The healed empath starts realizing that constantly trying to be liked made them emotionally dependent on external validation. They measured their worth by how needed, wanted, appreciated, or accepted they were by others. If someone pulled away, they blamed themselves. If someone became cold, they tried harder. If someone misunderstood them, they exhausted themselves explaining their intentions. But healing changes the entire mindset, because the empath finally understands that being a good person does not require endless self-sacrifice. They realize boundaries are really not acts of aggression. They are acts of self-respect. And at first, this new version of the empath feels unfamiliar even to themselves. For the first time, they begin saying things they once feared saying. No, that behavior is not okay. I'm not available for this anymore. I deserve reciprocity too. I will not continue this dynamic. Simple words. But for an empath who spent years prioritizing everyone else's comfort over their own well-being, those words feel revolutionary. And naturally, not everyone reacts well to this change. People who benefited from the empath's lack of boundaries often become uncomfortable the moment limits appear. Suddenly, the empath is called selfish for protecting their peace, difficult for expressing standards, cold for no longer tolerating emotional inconsistency. But the healed empath starts noticing something important. Healthy people respect boundaries. Manipulative people resent them. That realization changes everything. Because now the empath no longer feels guilty every time someone becomes upset with them. They stop believing they must manage everyone else's emotions in order to deserve love. They stop shrinking themselves to maintain fragile relationships built entirely on their silence. And perhaps the most powerful shift is this. The healed empath becomes willing to disappoint people, not out of cruelty, not out of ego, but out of self-respect. They finally understand that constantly overextending themselves to avoid upsetting others only created resentment, burnout, and emotional emptiness. They spent years trying to be everything for everyone while slowly losing connection with themselves. Healing teaches them that disappointing others is sometimes necessary for protecting your own mental and emotional stability. So now, instead of instantly saying yes, they pause. Instead of explaining every boundary repeatedly, they let their actions speak. Instead of chasing approval, they focus on alignment. Instead of fearing abandonment, they begin fearing self-abandonment more. That is the true shift. Because once an empath learns how painful self-betrayal feels, they can no longer comfortably return to the version of themselves that tolerated everything just to keep people around. And strangely enough, this new grounded energy often unsettles emotionally unhealthy people. The empath no longer reacts to every withdrawal, every mixed signal, every manipulative tactic. They stop proving their worth. Stop begging to be understood. Stop fighting for basic respect. They become calmer, more observant, more emotionally disciplined. Not because they stopped caring, but because they finally learned that caring about others should never require abandoning yourself. And this is often the stage where relationships either become healthier or completely fall apart. Because once the empath stops carrying all the emotional weight, the imbalance becomes impossible to hide. Some people rise to meet the healthier standard. Others disappear once they realize the empath can no longer be controlled through guilt, inconsistency, or emotional dependency. And although losing people hurts, the healed empath now understands something they once could not accept. Any relationship that requires you to betray yourself in order to keep it is already costing too much. So they stop chasing acceptance. They stop performing endless emotional labor just to feel valued. They stop trying to earn love through exhaustion. Instead, they begin choosing relationships where respect flows naturally. Fortitude is mutual, communication is honest, and boundaries are not treated like personal attacks. And in doing so, the healed empath discovers a kind of peace they never had before, the peace that comes from finally standing on their own side. One of the most painful realizations a healed empath faces is understanding that many people were never attracted to their heart alone, they were attracted to their lack of boundaries. That truth cuts deeply because the empath spent years believing their kindness was creating meaningful connection, when in reality it was often creating unhealthy access. Before healing, the empath gave endlessly. They gave time even when exhausted. They gave understanding after repeated disrespect. They gave reassurance to people who gave confusion in return. They gave loyalty to people who offered inconsistency. They gave emotional safety to people who never protected theirs. And because the empath naturally loved deeply, they assumed others loved the same way. They projected their sincerity onto people who were simply benefiting from their emotional openness. This is why healing can feel so heartbreaking. Because the empath slowly starts seeing that some relationships only worked because they tolerated things most emotionally healthy people would never tolerate. The connection survived because the empath overcompensated for everything missing. They carried the communication, the patience, the emotional labor, the forgiveness, the repair after conflict, the effort after distance. Without realizing it, the empath became the glue holding one-sided relationships together. And the moment they stop overgiving, everything begins changing. The healed empath no longer replies with endless understanding after being repeatedly neglected. They no longer excuse emotionally unavailable behavior as confusion or fear. They stop trying to earn consistency through loyalty. They stop believing that loving harder will eventually make someone emotionally mature. And suddenly certain people begin pulling away. At first this confuses the empath. They wonder, why is the relationship falling apart now that I'm healthier? But with time comes clarity. The relationship was never built on mutuality. It was built on access. Access to the empath's patience. Access to their forgiveness. Access to their emotional availability. Access to their inability to walk away. That is why some people become uncomfortable when the empath heals. Because healing removes the unlimited emotional supply they once depended on. The empath begins noticing patterns they ignored for years. Certain people only reached out when they needed comfort, validation, attention, or emotional support. Some disappeared whenever the empath needed the same care in return. Others became irritated the moment the empath expressed standards, boundaries, or emotional needs of their own. And perhaps the most painful part is realizing how many relationships were sustained by guilt. The empath felt guilty for saying no, guilty for creating distance, guilty for needing reciprocity, guilty for protecting their energy, guilty for no longer tolerating disrespect. So they kept giving, not because it felt healthy, but because they feared losing people if they stopped. Healing forces the empath to confront this fear directly. Because eventually they realize that if someone only values you when you are overextending yourself, then they are not attached to the real you. They are attached to the benefits they receive from your self-neglect. That realization changes the empath forever. Now they begin watching what happens when they stop overfunctioning in relationships. And what they discover is revealing. Some people completely disappear once the empath stops carrying the emotional weight alone. Some become angry when access is reduced. Some attempt guilt, manipulation, withdrawal, or emotional games to regain control of the old dynamic. Why? Because unhealthy relationships depend on imbalance. The moment balance appears, the dynamic either evolves or collapses. And for the healed empath, this stage can feel lonely. Not because they miss the dysfunction itself, but because they mourn the illusion they once believed in. They truly thought certain people loved them deeply. But healing reveals that some individuals were attached to comfort, convenience, and emotional access more than genuine connection. Still, this pain becomes part of the empath's awakening. Because for the first time, they stop confusing being useful with being loved. That distinction matters deeply. Being useful means people appreciate what you provide. Being loved means people value who you are even when you stop overgiving. The healed empath begins to understand that real love does not require emotional exhaustion. Healthy relationships do not demand constant self-sacrifice. Genuine connection does not punish boundaries or disappear the moment reciprocity is expected. And slowly, the empath stops performing kindness out of fear. They stop trying to rescue every broken person they encounter. They stop feeling responsible for fixing emotionally unavailable people. They stop believing someone's tragic past excuses ongoing harmful behavior. Instead, they start paying attention to consistency, accountability, emotional maturity, and mutual effort. And this changes their entire energy, because the healed empath no longer enters relationships asking, "How can I keep this person?" Now they ask, "Does this connection feel emotionally safe, reciprocal, and healthy?" That single shift protects them from repeating old patterns. And although some people accuse the healed empath of becoming colder, the truth is far different. The empath is not becoming less loving. They are simply no longer willing to destroy themselves to prove their love. They finally understand that endless giving is not always compassion. Sometimes it is fear of abandonment, and disguised as kindness. So now, instead of offering unrestricted access to everyone who enters their life, they become intentional, observant, selective. Not because their heart closed, but because they finally learned that protecting it matters too. There comes a stage in the empath's healing journey where they become tired in a way that sleep cannot fix. Not physically tired, but emotionally exhausted from constantly fighting to keep painful connections alive. For years, they believed love meant holding on no matter what, no matter how distant the other person became, no matter how many mixed signals appeared, no matter how often their needs were ignored. The empath kept trying to communicate better, trying to understand deeper, trying to fix the tension, trying to save relationships that were slowly destroying their peace. And because they loved deeply, they convinced themselves that walking away meant failure. They thought endurance was proof of loyalty. So they stayed in conversations that drained them, relationships that confused them, and emotional dynamics that left them constantly anxious. But healing changes what the empath values. At some point, they begin realizing that attachment is not the same thing as peace. Just because you feel emotionally bonded to someone does not mean the connection is healthy. Just because you love someone deeply does not mean they are good for your nervous system. That realization becomes life-changing, because for the first time, the empath stops asking, "How do I keep this person?" and starts asking, "Why does this connection cost me so much emotionally?" And the answer is often painful. The empath begins seeing how much of their life was spent emotionally surviving instead of emotionally living. Constant overthinking, constant anxiety, constant hypervigilance, waiting for replies, analyzing mood shifts, trying to decode emotional distance, walking on eggshells to avoid conflict, carrying the emotional stability of the relationship alone. They called it love, but their body called it stress. Healing reconnects the empath to something they ignored for years, their own inner peace. They begin noticing how calm they feel away from chaos, how much lighter life becomes when they are not constantly trying to rescue emotionally unavailable people, how their mind becomes quieter once they stop chasing, seeing reassurance from inconsistent individuals. And slowly, peace becomes more attractive than emotional intensity. This is a major transformation because many empaths unconsciously became addicted to emotionally chaotic dynamics. Not because they enjoyed suffering, but because instability felt familiar. The emotional highs and lows created a deep psychological attachment. Moments of affection after periods of withdrawal felt powerful, even addictive. But healing breaks that cycle. The empath starts recognizing that healthy love does not constantly destabilize them. Real connection does not leave them confused every day. Genuine care does not repeatedly trigger abandonment wounds just to keep the relationship alive. So now, when they encounter inconsistency, manipulation, emotional unavailability, or repeated disrespect, they respond differently. Before healing, they would chase clarity. Now they create distance. Before healing, they would over-explain themselves. Now they observe patterns quietly. Before healing, they feared losing people. Now they fear losing themselves inside unhealthy relationships. That shift changes everything, because once the empath experiences reach out, peace internally, they become far less willing to tolerate emotional chaos externally. They no longer romanticize suffering. They no longer believe pain is evidence of depth. They stop trying to save connections that repeatedly damage their emotional well-being. And perhaps the hardest part is accepting that some people will never become who the empath hoped they could be. This grief runs deep. The empath often stayed because they saw potential. They saw glimpses of softness beneath avoidance, moments of care beneath inconsistency, vulnerability beneath emotional walls. And they believed that if they loved hard enough, patiently enough, gently enough, eventually the relationship would stabilize. But healing teaches the empath a painful truth. Potential is not the same as reality. You cannot build a healthy relationship with someone's future version while continuously suffering in the present. So the healed empath begins letting reality guide their decisions instead of fantasy. They stop attaching themselves to promises, temporary affection, or rare moments of emotional availability. They start paying attention to consistency, effort, accountability, and emotional safety. And this often means walking away from people they still love. That is what makes healing so difficult. The empath does not stop caring overnight. They simply reach a point where caring for others no longer outweighs caring for themselves. They realize that constantly sacrificing their peace to maintain attachment is slowly destroying them from the inside. So they choose differently now. They choose calm over confusion, reciprocity over emotional chasing, consistency over intensity, peace over emotional addiction. And for many people around them, this new version of the empath feels unfamiliar. The old empath would have fought endlessly to save the connection. The healed empath notices the dysfunction, communicates once or twice, and if nothing changes, they detach quietly. Not because they never cared, but because they finally understand that love should not require constant emotional suffering to survive. The healed empath learns that protecting their nervous system is not selfish. Restoring emotional stability is not cruelty. Walking away from repeated pain is not weakness. It is wisdom earned through experience. And once they fully understand the value of inner peace, they stop begging toxic connections to stay in their life. They stop trying to force emotionally unavailable people to love them correctly. They stop carrying relationships alone just to avoid loneliness. Because now they know something they once struggled to believe. Peace is not loneliness. Sometimes peace is what finally appears when chaos leaves your life. One of the most powerful things about a healed empath is that the transformation is not always loud, but everyone feels it. The energy changes first. Before the empath even speaks differently, before they set visible boundaries, before they walk away from unhealthy relationships, something about them becomes harder to control. The desperation disappears. Before healing, the empath often carried invisible wounds that shaped every relationship they entered. Fear of abandonment, fear of being misunderstood, fear of losing connection. And because of those fears, they overextended themselves emotionally. They chased clarity. They tried to fix every misunderstanding. They became hyper-aware of other people's moods, reactions, and emotional shifts. Their energy constantly said, "Please don't leave. Please understand me. Please choose me." Even when they tried to appear strong, emotionally manipulative people could feel the over-availability underneath. They could sense the empath's willingness to overgive, over-explain, over-forgive, and overstay. But healing changes that energy completely. The healed empath no longer enters relationships trying to earn love through emotional labor. They no longer feel responsible for saving every connection. They stop seeking validation from emotionally unavailable people. And because of that, their presence becomes calmer, steadier, and far more difficult to manipulate. This shift confuses many people. The avoidant who once relied on distance to trigger pursuit suddenly notices the empath is no longer chasing. The narcissistic personality who once controlled the dynamic through inconsistency realizes the empath is no longer emotionally reacting. The emotionally immature person who expected endless forgiveness encounters boundaries instead, and for the first time, the empath becomes emotionally unpredictable to those who once understood exactly how to control them. Why? Because the healed empath is no longer operating from fear. They are operating from a war. That awareness changes how they respond to everything. Before healing, silence from someone they loved created panic. Now silence creates observation. Before healing, mixed signals created obsession. Now mixed signals create distance. Before healing, rejection destroyed their self-worth. Now rejection becomes redirection. The healed empath no longer sees every emotional withdrawal as something they must fix. They stop internalizing other people's emotional immaturity as proof they are unlovable. Instead of reacting impulsively, they begin paying attention to patterns calmly and clearly. And that emotional discipline completely changes their aura. Because people can feel when someone no longer fears losing them. The healed empath stops clinging, stops proving, stops convincing, stops begging for reciprocity. Not because they became emotionally numb, but because they finally understand their value does not decrease simply because someone failed to recognize it. This creates a quiet confidence that cannot be faked. The healed empath becomes more observant than reactive. They no longer reveal every emotional wound immediately. They no longer ignore red flags because they feel intense connection. They stop romanticizing emotional inconsistency as passion or depth. And perhaps most importantly, they stop abandoning their intuition. For years, the empaths sensed things they tried to rationalize away. They felt manipulation but called it confusion. They felt emotional unavailability but labeled it fear of intimacy. They felt imbalance but convinced themselves love required sacrifice. Healing reconnects them to their instincts. Now, when something feels emotionally unsafe, they listen. When effort is one-sided, they notice. When words and actions do not align, they believe the pattern instead of the excuse. That awareness makes them incredibly difficult to manipulate, because toxic dynamics survive through emotional access and emotional confusion. They rely on the empath second-guessing themselves, chasing validation, or tolerating inconsistency out of fear of abandonment. But the healed empath no longer operates from emotional scarcity. They understand that losing unhealthy attachment is not the same as losing love. So instead of trying to control outcomes, they focus on protecting their peace. They stop forcing relationships to work. I stop fighting for people who repeatedly show emotional indifference. They stop trying to prove their worth to individuals committed to misunderstanding them. And strangely enough, this is often when people from the past suddenly become curious about the empath again. Why? Because the energy they once depended on is gone. The empath who constantly pursued now pulls back naturally. The empath who tolerated everything now has standards. The empath who once over-explained now says less and observes more. There is a calmness in them now that did not exist before. Not the calmness of suppression, the calmness of self-respect. And while some people interpret this transformation as coldness, the truth is much deeper. The healed empath still loves deeply. They still care deeply. But now their compassion is guided by discernment instead of fear. They no longer give unlimited access simply because they feel an emotional connection. They no longer mistake chemistry for compatibility. They no longer allow potential to blind them to reality. Instead, they move differently, more grounded, more intentional, more emotionally disciplined. And this final stage of healing becomes the most poetic. Very good of all, because the empath no longer needs to announce their growth. Their boundaries reveal it. Their peace reveals it. Their silence reveals it. The old version of the empath desperately wanted to be chosen. The healed empath finally chooses themselves.